Welcome back, students. This is part 2 of the topic shifting of tax burden. In the last part, I told you about impact, incidence and shifting. So now we are going to discuss about the shifting of tax burden or factors influencing incidence of taxation. Here we have to discuss under the point elasticity of demand and supply. In the first scenario, we will discuss about perfectly elastic demand. When demand is perfectly elastic, given the supply elasticity, the entire tax burden is on seller. This can be asked for true or false or fill in the blanks. The entire tax burden is on seller. Diagrammatically, we can prove like this. In the diagram, DD is the demand curve. This DD is the demand curve. It shows it drawn horizontally. It is a horizontal demand curve. It shows perfectly elastic demand. You all are aware that under perfectly elastic demand, demand curve is horizontal straight line parallel to x-axis. And the supply curve SS is the original supply curve before the tax. So when the tax imposed, the supply curve shifts to S1 S1. It shifts to S1 S1. The vertical distance between two supply curve indicate the amount of tax. So the entire tax burden is borne by the seller. Here tax per unit is TE1. It is TE1, and the total tax amount paid by the supplier is TE1PN. This is what you have to write under perfectly elastic demand. There is no change. The perfectly elastic demand means demand is changing. And when the supply curve, after the tax, supply curve is shifting as S1 S1. So this tax burden is TE1PN. So this is the first case under which the entire tax burden is borne by the seller. Now the next is perfectly inelastic demand. When demand is perfectly inelastic, the entire incidence of tax burden is on the buyer. Entirely on the buyer, because demand is perfectly inelastic. Now see, perfectly inelastic demand curve is a vertical straight line parallel to y-axis. Okay, since demand does not change after the imposition of the tax, the price rises from E to E1. So the entire burden is borne by the buyers, and the whole burden is E1P1P. It is totally borne by the buyer. So when demand is perfectly inelastic, the entire burden is on buyer, and when the demand is perfectly elastic, the entire burden is on seller. Now moving to the next point, elasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply, when the supply is perfectly elastic, the entire incidence of tax is on the buyer. Now see here the supply curve, it is S1 is S and S1, these are the two supply curves. S is the original one and S1 is the new supply curve after imposition of the tax. After the imposition of the tax, the equilibrium price changes from E to E1, and that is from this, that means we can say that price is rising from OP to OP1, and the tax amount is TE1. So the entire burden is falling on buyer, and the total amount of tax burden is area TE1P1P. This is when the supply is perfectly elastic. So in case of perfectly elastic supply, the entire burden or incidence of tax is on the buyer. Now next is perfectly inelastic supply. In this case, the entire incidence of tax is on the seller. When the supply is perfectly inelastic, the seller is unable to adjust the supply after the imposition of the tax. In this case, the price will remain the same, so the entire burden falls on the seller. This is what you have to understand about this. These are 4 conditions we discuss under the incidence and taxation, like perfectly elastic demand. When the demand is perfectly elastic, DD is the demand curve, which is a horizontal straight line, and the entire burden is on the seller. Perfectly inelastic demand, this DD is this supply demand curve, that is a vertical straight line parallel to y-axis, and the entire burden is on the buyer. Then perfectly elastic supply curve is a horizontal straight line parallel to x-axis. So the the entire burden is on the buyer. And the last is perfectly inelastic supply, the entire burden is on the seller. This is what you have to write about the elastic factors influencing incidence of taxation. Here you have to give the diagrams, all the 4 diagrams you have to give, and you have to complete your answer. The question can be explain the factors influencing incidence of taxation in case of elasticity of demand and supply. So give 4 points: perfectly elastic demand, perfectly inelastic demand, and perfectly elastic supply, and perfectly inelastic supply. So you have to cover all these points in your answer. Thank you very much.